Okay, so despite the sort of slightly anti-platform-centric approach we might have put across earlier, our shared interest lies in understanding the increasingly central role of mobile messaging apps in particular, such as WhatsApp, in contemporary communication and social life. So if mobile messaging was once used mainly to ask family members to pick up milk on their way home, it's now expanded to become a primary means through which we organise our social, professional, domestic, political and religious lives. So I'm going to show you an example, an extract from a WhatsApp chat. And this is between Ava, a 35-year-old Italian Catholic who's living and working in the UK and a mother of 2 small children, and her Muslim friend Amira. Hang on. Oh, sorry. Basic. Oh, here. Oh, I haven't used that yet. That's strange. Does that work? It'll suddenly whiz through all the slides, won't it?
Please hold.
Yes. Oh, that's gone.
Yes.
Yeah.
Try this. It should work now.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry if that's difficult to see, actually. Can people read that at all? Oh, gosh. Was that a no? No at the back. So this is an extract from a WhatsApp chat. And I'm going to talk you through it slightly, especially for those at the back. So, as I said, Amira is Muslim, but her daughter Esther goes to the same Catholic school as Ava's daughter Stella. And she's frequently upset by the failure of the school to fully accommodate the Muslim pupils. So here in her message, Amira starts by saying, "I'm fuming. Apparently today Esther did something wrong and the teacher told her to apologize to Jesus for her wrong choices and made a cross sign on her forehead." And Esther actually thought she still had the cross on her forehead and she's going to write to the head teacher. In her voice message, Ava explains that Esther wasn't being sort of individually punished, but she was being included in a Christian ritual around Ash Wednesday. So from a linguistic perspective, there's a lot you can say about this extract, especially if you could actually read it. So for example, we could look at how Amira makes explicit her effective positioning towards what's happened with a range of linguistic resources, punctuation, such as punctuation flooding. And we could also explore Ava's mode switching, by which she uses a voice message for an extended narrative or explanation. So it's a voice message of nearly 2 minutes there. And then she uses the text message for what San Pietro and Koenig call a meta-communicative supplement, which frames the voice message as the marked choice. And in this case, it draws on the visual affordances of the text message to guide Amira's attention to the content of the voice message. So the text message basically says, please read this, please listen to this voice message before you write to the head teacher. But what Agnieszka and I have increasingly become interested in is illustrated here in the 2-hour gap between Amira's messages and her friend's response. So Amira's messages come in around 1807, and Ava responds 2 hours later at 2003. So mobile messaging has the potential for quasi-synchronous interactions, and studies suggest that timely responses are preferred. It's better if you reply quickly. This means that it's relevant to seek to explain any apparent delays, however exactly you define that. So does Ava see the message? If she doesn't, why not? If she does see it, why doesn't she reply more quickly? What's she and what's Amira doing in those 2 hours? And what does the delay tell us about mobile messaging norms and the place of mobile messaging in these women's lives? So it's notable that neither interlocutor explicitly holds Ava accountable for the delay. It goes unacknowledged. No one mentions that 2 hours have passed. What does all this mean for how we as researchers understand what constitutes a mobile messaging encounter? What are its context and what are the boundaries? So in our current research, we aim to explore how mobile exchanges like this are embedded in the immediate physical and social contexts in which they're sent and ideally received, how they potentially intertwine with other conversational encounters and activities, both online and offline, and how they're shaped by people's relational and ideological concerns. Our ultimate interest is in how individuals manage this complex communicative situation and what this tells us about the contemporary networked individual. So what we'll do in the rest of the talk is to talk you through the development of our ideas and methodology through two key projects. The first is translation and translanguaging, or TLANG, which Agnieszka will focus on, and then a smaller follow-up project, Mobile Conversations in Context, or MoCo, which I'll talk through. And we'll focus on three key aspects of our methodology: the post-digital ethnography, the networked individual, and the day-in-the-life approach. And at the end, we'll come back to Ava and Amira and see what light our approach can throw on the way in which Ava manages her mobile conversations in context. And then we'll end with some thoughts on current issues and future directions.
So as Caroline said, I'm going to take you briefly, and that's more of a reminder to myself, through the TLANG project. I was dreading reading out the whole title because I can never pronounce all the words in a way that sounds sort of good. So the TLANG project was what started us off around shaping our understanding, methodological approach, and our understanding of the communicative patterns that we saw in our participants. It was a large linguistic ethnographic project that lasted 4 years and was led by Professor Angela Crease. It involved us looking at 4 cities in 4 contexts. The cities are listed there: Birmingham, Cardiff, Leeds, and London. And we looked at a range of contexts within which we investigated participants. These were business, heritage, sport, and law. Here, we've got an example of what we collected around one site and one key participant. This participant, Edita, that I'll be referring to in a short summary of the project, was observed at work for 4 months, was audio recorded at work, interviewed twice. The first time it was an initial interview, and then it was data-focused interview. She also audio recorded her interactions at home and video recorded some of her interactions with family and friends. We also collected the digital data from her, which formed part of a home data collection set. Although some of the messages were sent during her working hours, we sort of counted that as a home data collection. And although we were open to receiving any form of digital communication from our participants, we mainly got data from them from mobile messaging apps. These included SMS, WhatsApp, WeChat, Viber, and Facebook Messenger for most of the participants. So it was quite limited. In most cases, we collected timed screenshots from our participants' phones, and it was either them doing screenshots and sending these to us, or us doing screenshots with their permission from their phone. But what was important is that our participants were in control of which data to share with us for analysis, which one to keep to themselves and not share. For example, they didn't want to submit messages that were either too boring, as in they saw them as too boring, which we would have loved to have, or too personal, too sensitive in some way. Also, there were situations where we as researchers got some data that we then deemed was too sensitive or too personal or too intimate. One of the examples that I can share with you is that we got a video recording where Edita was half naked and lying in bed and talking to her daughter. And another one where her daughter, 10-year-old daughter, were only wearing knickers. So we're obviously not showing these, although they were given to us. So in the case of TLANG, digital data was a new element. So our methods of approaching that, this was basically a new element added to well-established methodology of linguistic ethnography. So our methods of dealing with that data, how to embed it, how to approach it, how to analyze it, how to store it, how to demarcate the field site and so on, were exploratory and necessarily ad hoc. We didn't really focus on collecting any systematic logs of what was being done at the same time as sending messages or anything. That just wasn't the focus. What we did is we focused on relationship building, which is what linguistic ethnography is. So what we got from that was access to data and trust from participants, and also some level of authority with which we could then comment on what was happening in these messages, obviously involving the key participant in interpreting our data at the same time. And our data collection practices and initial observations pointed us to the way that this digital communication seemed to blend seamlessly within the participants' offline lives, as we said here, and made us realize that these participants live in conditions of post-digital society. I'm talking, I mean, this sounds like a truism now, which Jens also said, but that was way back, 2014, and you know, that was really quite something. We approached this differently at the time. Now we started seeing this communication as an inherent part of being human, rather than something disruptive or something new or different, or and so on. Within the post-digital approach, we not only understood online interactions within the context of physical settings in which it occurred, but also recognized the role in which these interactions may have had in shaping people's offline activities, as well as their personal histories and ideologies and so on. There were clear parallels between the blended approach in TLANG and that of research which focused on online and offline observations. But our TLANG methodology departed from these approaches in terms of the balance between the offline and online data. Rather than combining offline and online ethnography or using the non-digital to inform our analysis of the online world, we gathered that online data as part of a generally offline ethnography. So the balance very much in the offline. Online data or digital data is just an addition. So that's where we were. Our analysis then, the linguistic analysis, was used to explore our networked individuals' practices across all the social spaces they inhabited, including the online ones. So there's no focus on the online. The question that we were left with was how to identify and demarcate the field site which crossed multiple offline contexts and multiple online platforms, and how to approach working with the data collected from a range of platforms and contexts without falling into comparisons, something that would impose artificial separations and distinctions, disconnections within that each participant's communicative practices. So what that led us to is two things. The first one was a decision to orient our research not around a location, like in Penny Cook and Suri's work, for example, or a platform or a context, but around a networked individual, which we said in our earlier position statement. And that was an individual who sat at the node of their own communicative practices, as a node in the center of overlapping social and material networks. It also made us approach our data from the perspective of polymedia and recognize elements of various repertoires at a range of different levels within that repertoire. This focus enabled us to shift from our primary concern with the affordances and constraints of any one platform or online space to an understanding of the different ways in which networked individuals exploited certain affordances across multiple sites, potentially differently, both in the digital and the non-digital realm that they lived with. And we focused on the communicative purpose that they were trying to achieve rather than the tools or the specific signs that they were using. We then traced these communicative patterns and the nuance of how individual repertoires were constructed, adapted, and drawn on in particular communicative contexts. And this, in turn, enabled us to get closer to an understanding of that individual and their practices as a whole. As part of our methodology, we drew on an approach to the representation and analysis of data which foregrounded the way in which individuals move between different digital conversations in the course of their everyday interactions. This day-in-the-life approach involved our taking all the digital interactions of an individual participant over the course of the whole data collection and mapping them chronologically rather than separating them by interlocutor, by platform, or in any sort of other way. It was basically listed by time. We then extracted a single 24-hour period of time within this analysis to zoom in on, It sometimes was approximate, so we allowed for conversation that started just before or finished just after that 24-hour period. And we entered that data through the gateway of that network individual. Again, focusing on how these practices look for this particular person that we saw as a node. And this allowed us to acknowledge the multiple threads of mobile messaging in which one individual simultaneously engages, and the way that these threads interweave in an individual's polymedia communicative practice throughout the day. So to bring it all together, we had an individual, we had the totality of the online and offline practices, the totality being kind of with a caveat related to what we spoke about before, and a specific time period that we pulled out. As a case study, Edita, you'll see here that all the data that we collected for her, how much there was. You see that the social media mobile messages was just part of, tons and tons of other data. We took photographs around the shop where she worked, around the places where she, that she frequented. And at the time, just a little bit about Edita, at the time of our data collection of our project, Edita ran a Polish shop in Newham in London with her husband, and she had a daughter who at the time was 10 years old. They moved from Poland in 1997, so had been there for a good while, and their daughter was born in the UK already. In our sort of quest to understand her social media and digital data use, we identified that she mainly used 4 types of digital data: SMS and iMessage, Viber, and Facebook Messenger, and mainly used that to communicate in 4 contexts: business interactions with suppliers to the Polish shop that she ran, business sort of pre-transactions with her customers, and communication with friends in Poland, as well as interactions with her husband and daughter. And they were spread across various platforms. As I said before, Edita had the agency to select which data to provide to us. And of course, what that means is that there were some gaps, or there could have been gaps. We just never knew whether there were any gaps in our data. So this data selectivity posed problems, especially if you're trying to to map out a totality of somebody's communication. So we're very aware that this didn't really serve the purpose, but it opened our eyes to a certain way of looking at things. And I mentioned also some ethical considerations and our interest in relationship building mainly. But I want to just emphasize that we noticed that although we can try and map something out, we don't actually have the data or even a promise of this was all of our communication. But still, we were able to have a look at various uses. I'm going to show you now a few examples of what we found, how it was mapped out. So this is what we did with our data. So we had iMessages, Viber, and then we have more Viber, Facebook Messenger, iMessage. You see, they kind of interweave. The timings are on the left. Start on Sunday the 21st. That's when Edita communicates with her supplier, work communication, midday, exchanges some messages. Then she moves on to parenting online via Viber with her daughter Susanna, and that happens at 11:22, 11:34, and then continues with a gap between 11:38 and 1:04. And then there's further communication with somebody else, a customer, at 1:32, 1:48. So you see that there is more of a compilation again of messages more or less at the same time. We started noticing that. We were also thinking about how Edita uses these interactions, why sometimes she would text, sometimes she wouldn't. And we asked her, for example, just to give you an idea of how she uses messaging with the sales representative. She showed some understanding and awareness and the kind of conscious decision making around that involved, so described here. We asked why she didn't call, or why the sales representative didn't call her to make arrangements for deliveries. And she explained that this because it's more convenient for him and for me. So the supplier might be driving or taking an order in another shop at the time, and it's awkward for him to answer the phone. So we've agreed that we would communicate in this way. So she's highlighted to us the fact that the external world influences how she makes decisions in the online world. So we were working with this. And here we had examples of these gaps. And then a further gap here between 2:33 and then 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock in the evening, again, indicating that this, what we later called device attention. And I just want to show you what then we picked up from our video data. This is not, what is being said is not so important. It's going to be a very short clip. And I'm going to see, but what I would like you to have a look at is how, where the mobile phones are in this interaction. So here we're dealing with the 10-year-old daughter trying to make a recording for the researchers, trying really hard. The parents being sort of interested, but not exactly. That's Edita. You can't see her face, and her husband is sitting at the table. So see what happens to the phones.
A ja opisu, a ja rozmiarów, czego tak, w tym opisie jest assert, nie? A ja rozmiarów, jak za tą cenę to już wydało podać chyba jaki jest rozmiar pasa, no to też. To 234? No to jaka mogła być ta cena?
Okay, so in this short video, which was in Polish, we have the dad and the mom talking at the table about some sort of shopping. So they want to buy something, and the man is looking at the phone. She's looking at her phone, but then Tadeusz, which is the husband's name, he's kind of talking through what he's looking at, various kind of features of whatever he's buying. Then Edita puts her phone down. Then he shows her the phone, engaging her with his phone. And then she leans over to look at that phone, so engages with his screen. And then he pulls the phone back to himself. She picks her own one. So, there's an interweaving sort of use of each other's phones, of their own phone and so on. And then eventually Edita puts her phone down, and when she realizes her daughter is still recording, so kind of comes back to the offline world kind of more properly. So she's sort of interweaving there. And another example from the sort of the same evening is a consultation. So this here, they're having a discussion around asking a third person to buy something for them on their behalf, and that person not doing a great job, and they're sort of consulting each other on what to say to whether to say something to the person or not. So here the phone, no. Okay, here we've got a situation where the mom and the daughter are in the offline, talking or focusing on the dog, but the dad is constantly engaged with his phone and pulling the mom to contribute to his conversation, and sort of like meeting them and trying to get attention. There's sort of the daughter trying to get attention about the dog, and the man is trying to get attention around whatever he's consulting on. So we've noticed that there were multiple conversational threads. There was an overlap of online and offline communication at the same time, and there were some consultations for mobile exchanges happening offline, as well as, not from this data, consultation online as to how to participate in the offline world. And there were some limitations, right?
We argued about who should talk about the limitations. Come in the middle. But yeah, one of the limitations of the TLANG project design was that despite this sort of wealth of ethnographic data, it didn't give much systematic access to the immediate situational context in which mobile messages were being sent or received. So we had a rough idea of what a teacher was doing at any time. She was usually in the shop, but we couldn't pinpoint exactly what she was doing or exactly who she was with or what she was involved in. And the video data that we had, as Agnieszka has said, was sort of limited and largely incidental. It wasn't systematic. So the next project, MoCo, sought to build on this methodology to develop a sort of quite specific method to enable insight into the physical space in which at least one of the interlocutors is situated. So it developed a mixed methods approach involving survey data, more importantly, interviews, time use diaries, and then interactional messaging data. So the starting point was with a survey, just a clip of the survey. This was useful as a sort of baseline, if you like, against which to understand the interview responses. So one prominent theme was respondents' assertions about their agency and autonomy, their right to assert control over their communicative practices by replying in their own time was a strong theme. But more importantly, the survey served as a way of recruiting participants for the next stages. So 12 of the survey respondents were then interviewed before and after the diary and message data collection. And this happened online, I think partly because of COVID, actually. But the benefit of the online interview was that we were in a space in which people were very familiar and they were quite happy to be recorded, video recorded, which was very useful in a way that maybe they wouldn't have been if I'd had a video camera. So each participant then completed a 3-day diary. So this was basically an Excel spreadsheet in which they noted what they were doing every 15 minutes, what they were doing, where they were, who they were with, and where their phone was. This is taken from time use studies, which tend to be quite quantitative, and they look at, for example, do men or women spend more of their time doing housework? Has that changed over the years? That kind of study. So this was adapted for quite a different purpose in the context of this study. During those 3 days when they were keeping a diary, they also, well, at the end of the 3 days, they then submitted all the messages that they had sent or received in those 3 days. So these were messages sent on any mobile messaging app. And I sort of, to some extent, the participants defined that. But the overwhelming majority of messages were from WhatsApp, but other platforms are available. Other platforms were used. And they had freedom to choose what they submitted. So in some cases, they literally submitted everything, I'm fairly confident. Often they didn't submit messages because their contacts hadn't given consent. So the diary and the screenshots then formed the basis of the second interview. So this is the tiniest representation so far, which I know most people can't see, but this is another Teams interview, an online interview, in which I'm sharing my screen. So the participants' diary and their messages have been displayed in a Microsoft Access form, which means you click on a diary entry and all the messages that were sent and received in that time appear below. So this enabled sort of me and the participant to go through their day in a life, of their 3 days, and the participant talked me through what they've been doing, their relationships with the people involved, sort of why they'd replied when they had, why they hadn't replied, and that sort of thing. So this was a way of realizing our sort of day in the life approach, enabling an understanding of these individuals' everyday mediated communications, potentially across a range of messaging platforms and interlocutors. The recruiting of participants, so these are sort of overview of the participants, building relationships with trust was very key to this. The target population was basically busy adults, so most people, and they were recruited through my own social and professional network, so including friends of friends. So having been recruited in this way, half of them knew me personally, not necessarily, well, not my best friends, but people I had an existing relationship with, and half of them were friends of colleagues, colleagues of friends. One of them was the father of a friend, which we worked out as we were talking to each other. So there's lots that you can say about this sort of acquaintance interview, and in fact using sort of an acquaintance sample, but it did result in a less socially diverse population than you might want. So for example, all the participants were engaged either full or part-time in professional employment, except for the one who had retired from that. But there were interesting differences, I think, through factors like age and household, which meant, for example, that participants submitted a huge range of different number of messages, if that makes sense. So one person, the retiree, submitted 7 messages that they'd sent and received in the 3 days, and the person who submitted the most was 513 messages sent and received over those 3 days. So ethics was central to setting up the project and also responding to issues as they arose. So the main issue, I think, is the project demands a considerable commitment from participants, and one of the participants reflected that it was an intrusion into their personal lives. The participants were self-selecting. Many took part because of an interest in research. One of the participants was a research nurse who liked to take part in qualitative studies to know what it was like to be a participant, or they were interested in knowing more about their practices. And I was careful not to put any pressure on participants, despite, in some cases, the pre-existing relationship. And what was asked of them was minimized as much as possible, and I can say more about that if you like later. But I think what I generally felt actually from the project was that the participants gained personal benefits through talking about what were very mundane practices that they didn't normally get to talk through with anybody, about their lives, their messaging practices and their relationships. And one person said, I like that it made me conscious of not wasting my life. I was more aware that, you know, don't just spend a load of time scrolling on Facebook. So the diary did shape practices in the sense of someone chose to have a bath and read a book rather than just sitting on Facebook, because they knew they were then going to have to sort of tell me about it. So to finish, I'll just stay here for a minute. To finish, I'm just going to return to the interaction between Ava and Amira. Actually, I think I'm okay for time. So to sort of explore the insights that this approach enables, and to remind you that our aim is to understand their mobile conversation that we looked at earlier, in the context of the parallel online and offline encounters and activities in which Ava, the participant, was simultaneously engaged, as well as the various preoccupations that were competing for attention at that time. So I hope you can read this a little bit better than the previous screen. I always assume a huge screen, I don't know why. But here, it's a format that's actually adapted from Ito and Akabi's much earlier work, although their data and their project was different. And what I've done here is to insert the messages that Ava received in a particular time span, sort of within her diary. So as you can see, some of you can see, between 6 and 6:15 in the evening, this, yeah, I should have told you when this was. This was early 22, so March 22, well, about Easter 2022. So between 6 and 6:15 in the evening, Ava is helping her children with their dinner. And at this point, she receives messages from 3 people. So her husband, Carlos, messages to confirm that he's leaving work soon, which means that Ava can go to church. A few minutes later, we have Amira messaging Ava to express her anger about the Catholic school and her daughter being made to apologize to Jesus. And then later on, Ava's sister in Italy, Claretta, messages their family group chat to ask when Ava will be free to talk that evening. And Ava told me in an interview that she saw all these messages once the children had finished dinner, and she was checking her phone while the children was playing. So this is between sort of 8:15 and 7:15. She tells her husband to let her know when he leaves work, and she messages her sister, Claretta, to say she's going to church, to put her off calling. But she doesn't reply at this point to Amira's message, as we know. In an interview, she said, yes, that was a busy time for me. What she was doing was trying to get the kids in bed by 7, because at 7 mass in the church would start, and she was waiting for her husband to come home so that he could take over the kids. So yeah, that's why I texted her once I came back from church. Amira's, I think it's fair to say, sort of apparent distress, and Ava's awareness that she could help by explaining the situation made a reply conditionally relevant. So she could see her friend was upset, and she could understand and didn't want her to feel more upset than what she should have. So it's important for her to clear this up. She knew that the explanation of this would take a while. I don't know why I'm changing the pronouns here, but she couldn't just tell her in a quick message that it wasn't as bad as it looked. It was something that took time, and these are things she told me in interview. Also weighing on Ava's mind at this moment is her own sort of separate concerns about the school's plans for Easter. So she was unsure that they should be celebrating World Book Day on Good Friday, which the school was planning to do. So she'd messaged her priest about this earlier to ask him for his advice, and he replies now, say sorry for the late reply, and perhaps they can talk after Mass. So Ava then replies with a voice message. So this is the transcript of the voice message, which basically says she's not yet sure if she can talk to him because she doesn't know if she can come to Mass or not. It depends whether her husband can come home. Is this enough detail of Ava's life for you? As she's leaving the message, as she's leaving that voice message, her husband messages to say he's coming home. And at 18:45, at 6:45, she takes the children upstairs, her husband returns from work, and she goes to church. Her sister tries to call while she's in church, and she replies to say, I'm at Mass. And she ignores another message from her other sister, which is sent to their group. So anyway, during all this, Ava's not forgotten her suspended conversation with Amira. So she's been, if you like, waiting to find a moment like this. She's back at home now, preparing dinner in the kitchen by herself. And so it's at this point that she sends Amira the voice message, explaining that her daughter had likely not been personally reprimanded, but had been involved in the celebration around Ash Wednesday. In this case, it's likely that the choice of voice message rather than text message was both situational and production related. So situationally, it's prompted by the fact that Ava is simultaneously cooking, so she needs one hand free. She told me if I need both hands, I'm more likely to send a voice message. If I need both hands to do something else, I'm more likely to send a voice message. But it's also dependent on factors related to its production. So she said she tends to leave voice message if what she wants to say is particularly complex or long. So it would take a very long written message to convey the same meaning. And in this case, her voice message is, not expecting you to read this, she's basically explaining Ash Wednesday to Amira. So I think it's long, complex, and likely to be considered as personal. So following, I'm going to stop now, you'll be pleased to hear. I'm not going to go on with the conversation, but they continue with a quasi-synchronous exchange. They send 19 messages between 2010 and 2022. At that point, Ava sits down to have dinner with her husband, and there's a sense that she's now sort of relieved of the weight of having managed to respond to Amira. And she told me, I just thought, okay, you know what? We can pick it up again afterwards in person. So overall, I think this analysis shows how Ava uses timing to manage multiple mobile conversations within the context of her offline activities. So she's replying immediately to messages which relate most closely to the activities and matters with which she's engaged, and she's suspending conversations less relevant, namely Amira's. So the heightened response latency, or the delay, the apparent delay, appears to be accepted by both interlocutors. So neither account explicitly or implicitly for the lack of an immediate uptake, and so we might infer from that this is not untypical of their wider practice. But while Amira's message is less immediately relevant to what else is going on, a response remains conditionally relevant. So Amira's messages are deemed neither trivial nor unimportant, and Ava remains aware of the need to reply as soon as she can. So she doesn't forget to reply. Instead, Ava waits for a moment when she's free to give Amira's message her full attention, and we can speculate that she may have been planning what to say as she walked home from church, or as she prepared to start cooking. So the conversation's not on hold, it's still live. And Ava's visit to the church can be seen as nested inside and very much part of this ongoing exchange. So this day in the life approach, we think, raises important questions about what constitutes a conversation or a speech event, or whether such things exist at all in a post-digital society.
And just to round off, in terms of methodologically speaking, we'd like to develop this approach then in a way that takes advantages of rapidly changing, advancing technological tools, whilst maintaining our focus on understanding and valuing individual as a point of entry into their own interactive communicative purpose practices. The method developed in MoCo can be integrated into the post-digital linguistic ethnography trialed by TLANG, enabling us to embed systematic insights regarding the immediate physical and social settings into our wider understanding as to how mobile communication is shaped by personal, relational, and ideological contexts, and how it interweaves with offline encounters and activities, such as including all the voices that came into play in shaping Eva's response to Amira in the example quoted just now. This could involve also, in terms of developing our methodological tools and approach, involving more diverse participant groups in terms of age, socioeconomic background, and linguistic profile. But this poses more challenges. It was mentioned already by the participants that this participation involves quite a commitment and also technological literacy, and also it can be felt as an intrusion into their lives. Then the scope of the endeavor can be widened to include all mobile phone activities, including mobile messaging, social media, and other apps use in what Francisco Hughes calls the smartphone app ecosystem. That means that we can also include more technology in the way we capture our data. So we can use screen capture, software of various kinds, GPS, which can mean that we can capture the data more accurately, but also poses question then about autonomy and agency of our participants as to how much they share and how they get potentially datafied in the context. So there's a question of for boundaries. However, technology would nonetheless be helpful in ensuring that we can represent our complex data sets in ways that most effectively facilitate linguistic analysis. Taking our overall interest in factoring in mobile communication as an inherent part of being human and the above challenges, what seems increasingly clear is that we need an integral, multi-layered approach that includes both linguistic and multimodal analysis, as well as other disciplinary pursuits. So, for example, psychology could be accessed, used, invited to contribute through the analysis of how intersubjective meaning is actually created at points of connection and disconnection with others. We could also access expertise from colleagues who specialize in eye tracking, who could contribute to our understanding how device attention works in a more systematic way. We could also resort to historical linguistics to understand the trajectories of our communicative practices and demarcate points of departure. This may uncover new roles that mobile phones and other types of digital devices play in our everyday lives, including as personal assistants, gatekeepers that enable us to selectively archive or mute certain conversations from our lives at particular points when we want to be more present in the now, and perhaps as holders of distributed cognition, which we mentioned earlier, through memos, notes, or journaling. So these are the things that we'll be working on, and we would really like to hear from people who take up the challenge alongside. Thank you.